Hello and welcome to this video lecture, which will begin our exploration of the Great Peloponnesian War. This is not to be confused with the earlier conflict we explored in an earlier video lecture called the First Peloponnesian War. Indeed, that was a mere warm-up compared to the main event that we will be examining over the course of almost the next 3 units. So the Peloponnesian War itself, a conflict that will tear the Greek world apart over a period of roughly 27 years from 431 to 404 BCE. And it will involve, as I just mentioned, all of the Greek world and some entities outside of it, including the Persian Empire, which will make an appearance in the closing phases of this conflict. The war itself will involve not just Athens versus Sparta, but Athens and all of its allies, the members of the Delian League. And of course, Sparta will have an alliance of its own that it can call upon, the Peloponnesian League, which was one of the oldest formal alliances in Greek history. So the contest will rage in roughly 3 phases. There'll be a 10-year period of rather intense combat from 431 to 421. There'll be a brief pause, and then things will pick up again in the teens, roughly from 413 on to its conclusion in 404 BCE. So this is the conflict that will, in many ways, mark the demise of ancient Greek civilization, leave it vulnerable and exhausted by the time the 5th century closes, vulnerable to outside takeover from the Macedonians, and that we'll look at it at a later unit. But this conflict is, in many ways, still amongst the most studied conflicts, certainly of the ancient period, and we can thank the historian Thucydides for that. Thucydides is going to be our primary source and our main guide as we navigate the intricacies of this very complex conflict. Now, some words on Thucydides. First of all, as you can see there, he lived through the conflict itself. Indeed, he was a participant, born in 460. We're not sure when he died. We do know that he had finished writing his history. Well, I should say he lived to the end of the Peloponnesian War and was in the process of finishing his history when he gets to the events of the year 411 BCE, and then abruptly his history breaks off. So it is his history of the Peloponnesian War is not a complete record of the conflict, but it certainly is the best analysis. Because Thucydides was, in many ways, a much more analytical historian than Herodotus had been. Thucydides, which provided much more scrutiny to his sources, and again provided a level of analysis that was in many ways lacking in the history of Herodotus. So we see that his legacy, the legacy of Thucydides, is not only a great history of a great conflict, but also in many ways he is known as an intellectual godfather of sorts to a school of international relations that is still very much alive and well today, called the Realist School. And that is because Thucydides strongly believed that events are not determined by wishful thinking. Instead, events are determined by how things really are. And oftentimes what that boils down to, if I can be reductive, is power politics. Power is the ultimate arbiter of events. And again, you can have all the wishful thinking that you want about how things should be, but Thucydides, as we'll see in some of the readings, it clearly does indicate that wishful thinking is it's foolish to fall into that train of thought. understand how things really are, and then plan accordingly. And just off the top of my head, I'm reminded of something that I heard on the radio on NPR the other day. They were interviewing John Mearsheimer, who is very much a realist in foreign affairs, and he was discussing the current events in the Ukraine, in which the Russian President Putin is clearly playing a power politics game. And Mearsheimer, you can find his article if you're really that interested, notes that in the case of the Ukraine, it's likely realist power politics that will ultimately win the day. And all the diplomacy in the world is not going to dissuade somebody who is willing to commit military force to achieving an objective or goal. So that's, anyway, the continuing legacy of Thucydides, and whether or not you disagree with this, it's still, I think, helpful to engage with the ideas that Thucydides represents when discussing a particular conflict, the Peloponnesian War, or in any conflict in which, again, violence is felt to be a legitimate option to achieving policy goals. So briefly, some of the key differences now that you have studied Herodotus and are about to study Thucydides, some of the things you should look out for is Herodotus, even though he's the first, he still has some skeptics as to whether or not he deserves the title of father of history. And it is Thucydides that, if you were to look at certainly how the ancients viewed both Herodotus and Thucydides, Cicero, the Roman statesman, felt it was Thucydides who does deserve that title, father of history. And there are many modern scholars that would agree with that assessment. Now, some of the key differences between Thucydides and Herodotus are the fact that Thucydides entirely omits the supernatural from his history. If you remember, Herodotus, he did a good job of moving away from Homer's use of the gods constantly throughout the Homeric epics. They appear constantly. Herodotus does a good job of limiting the kind of divine intervention aspects of his history to the Delphic oracle. Well, Thucydides doesn't even really give credence to oracles. So he tries as much as possible to explain events entirely on human terms, without, again, any recourse to divine intervention. So that's a big difference toward a secularization of history. And number two here, where Herodotus, his stated goal was to memorialize the past and the hero and the deeds done by the heroes. Again, a very Homeric type of goal. Thucydides really does suggest that the horrors of the present, of the conflict that he lived through, that he participated in, the Peloponnesian War, those horrors of the present can provide some insight into future events, because Thucydides, as a realist, is also a very, very profoundly pessimistic when it comes to human nature. He believes that there's no way human beings will ever eradicate warfare. It is an unfortunate curse of the human condition, and given this, you might as well learn to play the game, learn what works and what doesn't whenever your society decides to commit itself to armed conflict. And so Thucydides, his history does read in some parts like a how-to manual, how to avoid certain pitfalls, and he really does highlight the mistakes and explains why they're mistakes, and perhaps suggests other options that could have been employed. But he does believe that his work is a work for all time, and here I'm actually paraphrasing one of the lines of Thucydides, that human behavior will always repeat. There's there is no way that human nature will ever be fundamentally altered, and therefore that means warfare will always be with us. And finally, Herodotus, in his history, even though we didn't read the whole history, a lot of it is made up of what have been termed digressions, in which Herodotus moves away from the main area of operations, the Greco-Persian Wars, to explore different cultures, and a lot of digressions and seeming tangents that he goes off on. Thucydides' history is much more focused. The scope is limited to the Peloponnesian War and those events that bear directly on that particular conflict. So it's a tighter, much more focused work. Now, Thucydides himself, again, he was born around 460, so he is living in the heyday of the Athenian democracy, of the radical democracy in the age of Pericles. Pericles came into prominence in the 450s, so Thucydides grew up knowing nothing but the leadership of Pericles as a statesman. Now, Thucydides was of the Aristoi class. His family was very wealthy. They had properties throughout the broader Aegean along the Thracian coast area. They were involved in mining in that region, and but Thucydides spends his young adulthood in Athens, and he is elected as a general in the year 424. And it is a brief military career because Thucydides, in his first official duty as a area commander, fails to prevent the Spartan takeover of a city called Amphipolis, and we'll look at that particular episode in more detail when the time is right. But because of his failure, Thucydides is exiled from Athens for 10 years. He again, you guys by now should know that the Athenian demos, the democracy, did not take kindly on failure, and oftentimes vented its frustration and its anger on its military commanders. Well, so Thucydides, when he is exiled in 424, he decides that he will spend his exile as productively as possible, and this is when he decides to write a history of the conflict that by that point in time had been raging for almost 7 years. So he was a proud Athenian. He was, up until his exile, certainly a contributing member of that society. But he was suspicious of the Athenian democracy. And of course, given the circumstances of his exile, he probably felt that this was an unfair punishment to him. But there are moments throughout the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides' history, where he indicates that democracy does have certain vulnerabilities that need to be examined, particularly in the crucible of conflict. And Thucydides makes it clear that Pericles is the man to run a functioning democracy. Now, this sounds like a contradiction, that you have one person singled out to basically run a democracy, which technically is supposed to be a government by the people, by all means. Well, Thucydides understood that that was unworkable, that you needed somebody that could focus the people, that could keep them in check, that could map out short-term and long-term policies and goals for the society, and who could navigate the intricacies not only of foreign policy but also of domestic politics. And clearly Pericles was the man to accomplish all of those goals. And he really, the image of Pericles is one of the quintessential wartime democratic leader. And Thucydides believed that when Pericles dies early on in the war, that is when Athens will almost immediately begin to lose its way. And this is going to be a profound event in the war. It will become a profound event in the overall course of the war because Thucydides believed that democracy is very vulnerable to demagogues. Now, the word demagogue is a term coined first by Aristotle, I believe, to describe people who play on the passions of the demos, leaders or those that aspire to be leaders who use raw emotion and highly charged rhetoric to fire up the common people and get them to number one, support the demagogue, and number two, support whatever policies the demagogue wants. And Thucydides clearly has no patience with these lesser men. He singles out a character known as Cleon, who we'll look at in a later video lecture as the kind of the key or the quintessential demagogue, who did not really have a long-term policy in place for the success overall of Athens, but simply used his rhetorical skills to manipulate the people. Now, Pericles, of course, was a very, very good orator. His speeches are well known. But for Pericles, the ability to speak well was necessary to achieve the agenda that would benefit Athens the most, and was in many ways a long-term agenda. So again, Thucydides clearly is a big fan of Pericles, but once Pericles is gone, he sees the key weakness of democracy being exposed, in that the common people will fall victim to these lesser political figures, and that will lead Athens on a road to disaster. Now, in one part of his history, Thucydides makes it clear that he believes that the war that he is writing about, this Peloponnesian War, is a war like no other, and it deserves to be recorded for all of posterity so that it can be studied and analyzed, and people can draw the lessons from it. Now, in many ways, he certainly is right, certainly within the Greek context. If you remember, when we began to explore warfare in the ancient Greek world, and we looked at the hoplite warfare in particular, we see that the rules were set to make battles between Greek city-states relatively brief. Warfare was pretty common, but the idea was that battles have to be brief and they have to be decisive. There has to be a clear winner and a clear loser so that the issue can be resolved and both parties can go back to doing what they were doing, which is most likely farming. So what makes the Peloponnesian conflict a war like no other is its grinding length. It's 27-year long period of conflict, which was certainly unprecedented up to that point in Greek history. And of course, Thucydides notes that there were certain structural conditions in place that would allow this conflict to go on and on and on, seemingly forever. The main point that we should be aware of, and that I'm sure you guys are, but I want to dust it off, is the fact that Athens and Sparta we're at a point now, by the time the war breaks out in 431, they could ignore the old rules of hoplite warfare. We know that the Spartans, they didn't have to worry about getting their warriors back to the fields in time to harvest or to plow. The Spartans had the helots to handle agriculture for them. So they could, theoretically and in actuality, commit to year-round campaigning, which was, in many ways, it was impossible for the vast majority, just about all the Greek city-states, to commit likewise. So the Spartans were in a position to commit year-round, and the Athenians will, as we'll see, under Pericles, will devise a strategy that will allow them to continue the fight day in, day out, year in, year out, for however long it takes. Indeed, Pericles, when we get into the specific context of the start of this conflict, Pericles seems to have anticipated a war that would go on for several years. So we do get a sense that plans are being made by Pericles and the Athenians to weather the storm, a long-term storm. Now, nobody could recognize, although there is a point where the Spartan king Archidamus does think that he says to his people that we may be bequeathing this war to our children, but that was kind of an isolated perception. But few could have anticipated 27 years of conflict. So let us now take a look at the immediate circumstances which led to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides divides causation into long-term and short-term. In the long-term causes were basically Sparta began to grow fearful at the rise of Athenian power, and therefore began to view Athens more and more as a threat. And Sparta, as we'll see, will be ultimately convinced by some of its allies that Athens is such a threat that war is the only option. That was the long-term cause. Now, the short-term causes had to do with an outbreak of stasis. And stasis, if you remember from a few units back, was a type of civil strife that occurred between the wealthy class and the not-so-wealthy class, and it could happen in any polis, and it did often happen. It was a common enough occurrence that the Greeks again developed this term stasis to describe it. The last time you and I had discussed stasis was when, prior to the outbreak of the Ionian Revolt, the island polis of Naxos experienced stasis, and the aristocratic faction was driven out and sought help from the tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, and you remember how that turned out. It led to bigger and bigger events that culminated, of course, in the Greco-Persian Wars. Well, we're going to follow a similar trend here. Now, in the previous video lecture on the Pentacontietia, we had concluded that lecture with a look at the First Peloponnesian War, which was fought roughly from 460 to about 445 BCE. In 445, the Spartans and the Athenians conclude what was called the 30 Years' Peace. Well, it is less than 10 years before that begins to unravel. And the unraveling has to do with the events of 436 BCE in a far-off area of on the fringe of the Greek world called Epidamnos, located up here. And Epidamnos experiences stasis. The democratic faction, by democratic I mean the common people, will drive the Aristoi out of the city. The Aristoi are going to use their wealth to hire mercenaries to besiege the city in the hope of reversing this basically involuntary exile of the Aristoi. And the Democrats inside the city of Epidamnos know that they need help, so they send a delegation to their metropolis. Now, if you remember about Greek colonization, you would have a city that would send out colonists to found a new city. And of course, the city sending the colonists out was the mother city, or the metropolis. And this is the case here, where Corcyra, here, the island polis of Corcyra, was the metropolis, or mother city, of Epidamnos. So the Democrats need help. They seek assistance from Corcyra, And of course, Corcyra, they hear out this delegation, and ultimately they decide, no, sorry, we can't help you out. We don't want to help you. And rather than take no for an answer, this democratic faction from Epidamnos next travels to Corinth here. Corinth was the metropolis of Corcyra, and in a way the grandmother of Epidamnos. So, as so often happens in family relations, if you don't get help from the parent, seek help from the grandparent. And in this case, Corinth hears out the Democratic faction and says, sure, we'll help you out. And that, of course, angers Corcyra, who believes that Corinth is unfairly meddling in its internal affairs. And in a way, Corinth was. Corcyra not happy with this, but as of now is just willing to mobilize its own resources to thwart any Corinthian aid from reaching Epidamnos. And there is a naval battle fought between Corcyran and Corinthian triremes right around here, and Corcyra actually wins. The Corinthians are now flustered and infuriated, so they vow that they're going to return with even more ships and a stronger military force. And the Corsyrans think, what should we do? Well, we should enlist the aid of a great power, and they reach out to Athens. And Thucydides recounts the speeches of the Corcyran delegation to the Athenian assembly, and there's one passage in particular I would like you guys to take note of, and that is Book 1, Chapter 33, in which the Corcyran delegation basically says, look, Athens, right now you are the #1 navy in the Greek world. Corinth is #2. We, Corcyra, are #3. If the Corinthians are able to take us over, they will now have access to our triremes, and they will become by far the most powerful naval force in all of Greece. So, what's it going to be, Athens? Are you going to allow this to happen, or are you going to preempt this from happening by helping us? And so the Athenians agree to help the Corsyrans. They send a force of 10 triremes. With strict orders only to engage the Corinthians if it looks like things are going very badly for the Corsyrans. And that's exactly what happens at the Battle of Sybota. And the Athenians do get involved against the Corinthians, and that is going to really sour Corinth toward Athens. And I should point out that if you look at this map, you'll note that Athens had maintained a dominance, naval dominance, in the eastern coast, along the eastern coast of Athens and throughout the Aegean, turning the Aegean, as I mentioned earlier, into an Athenian lake. Well, now that the Athenians have involved themselves on the western coast of Greece, it's making not only the Corinthians nervous. A lot of other Greek poleis are wondering what ultimately is Athens up to. Now, less than a year after this Battle of Sybota, in which the Athenians actually engage Corinthian triremes, the situation becomes even worse between Corinth and Athens when in the city of Potidaea rebels against Athens. Now, Potidaea was a member of the Delian League, and we saw that the Athenians would not tolerate any rebellion from any member of their alliance. But there is an additional factor in that Potidaea was another Corinthian colony. So the Corinthians had a connection with Potidaea. And in the course of this rebellion, the Corinthians actually send a force of about 1,600 hoplites to aid the Potidaeans in their rebellion. The Athenians are forced to commit significant assets to putting this rebellion down. There's a kind of a battle that is fought now between hoplites, between Athens and Corinthians. And ultimately the city is recaptured and is punished. But at this point, now we've got two major engagements between Athenian forces and Corinthian forces. And the Corinthians are at their wits' end. They're like, enough is enough. Athens seems to be really hammering us on wherever we look. So the Corinthians will submit their issues to arbitration at the Peloponnesian League. And this, of course, will bring in the Spartans, because the Sparta is the leader of the Peloponnesian League. Corinth was a member of the Peloponnesian League. So to have these grievances heard now will involve Sparta in determining what should be the response of the Peloponnesian League towards these Athenian actions. Now, the third thing that will further stir the pot here has to do with the city of Megara, right here. Okay, and Megara, of course, was the gateway into the Attic Peninsula, a very important city for the Athenians and also for the Peloponnesian League, because if the Peloponnesian League ever wanted to punish Athens, it would have to do so by marching through Megara into Athens itself. So Megara was a city that had at various times been an ally with and an adversary of the Athenians. And it's in the late 430s that Megara is kind of is in an adversarial posture with the Athenians, and Athens under Pericles. It's actually Pericles who Thucydides said was instrumental in passing a law called the Megarian Decree. And basically what this said was that Megara could not land its ship or conduct any trade with any member of the Delian League. And clearly this was an attempt to really hammer Megara economically, in the hope, scholars believe, of ultimately getting Megara to voluntarily join the Delian League. And of course, if Megara had joined the Delian League, now that would provide Athens with greater security on its western flank. And that's something that, quite frankly, the Peloponnesian League did not want to see happen. So all these issues in the mix, and of course Megara goes to the Spartans to seek redress too, and ultimately this will bring the Spartans and the Athenians into a confrontation in which war will be the result.